Greetings, everyone. This is Peg Brady at NOAA Fisheries in Silver Spring. Welcome to the EBFM seminar series. Today we're celebrating our first anniversary of the series, and I want to acknowledge this is hosted by NOAA Fisheries as well as the NOAA Central Library here in Silver Spring, Maryland. We'll be transporting all our attendees to Hawaii in just a moment. Our speakers are on the line: Gerry from the Pacific Islands Regional Office, and Jamie Gove from the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center. They'll be on the line pretty shortly to introduce their presentation. But before I begin, I just wanted to remind folks what initiated this series, and just give you a little bit of an overview, just take a brief moment to do that. EBFM, or I should say, NOAA Fisheries adopted a policy to implement ecosystem-based fisheries management and to focus in on managing our nation's fisheries. So thus, we call it EBFM for fisheries management. NOAA Fisheries staff across the country have been working to develop implementation plans to operationalize ecosystem-based fisheries management. And a key component of those plans is engagement with many of the parties that we engage with on a daily basis with respect to fisheries management. So thus, we wanted to increase the awareness about the work that's being done across the country in our science centers and in our regional offices to advance ecosystem-based fisheries management. And here are the main reasons, some of the main reasons of why we're doing it. We're hoping to support sustainable fisheries under the multiple mandates that NOAA Fishery works under. Address and prepare challenges, particularly for the changing environments that many of our regions are facing. We want to obviously facilitate the discussion about trade-offs, and some of our talks have really dug deeply into that issue of trade-offs. And then finally, to reap benefits by a more systematic approach to advance EBFM. In 2016, NOAA Fisheries adopted a policy and a roadmap. These are just some of the major principles that each of our regional centers and offices are working with to implement their or draft their plans, which will be available. They were available in draft form this past summer and will be finalized at the beginning of the next calendar year. And then clearly the plans are going to clarify some of the major priorities that each of the regions are facing. Improve internal coordination between our science and our management offices, and leverage ongoing work with existing resources. And obviously, a key component of this is working with our fishery management councils. We work hand in glove with the councils across the nation, and obviously include additional external stakeholders in the process. And these presentations are a way to shed light on how we might go about doing that as we proceed with advancing these plans. There are 9 plans, and this gives you a sense geographically of the scope of each of the geographic scope of each of the plans. So, and these plans in draft form are available on the NOAA Fisheries website. If you have any more questions, you're more than happy to email me after the presentation. And these are some of the key cross-cutting priorities that the plans will be addressing going forward. And I'll stop there, and now we're going to switch gears and go to Hawaii. And Gerry and Jamie are patiently waiting online to begin their presentation, so we're going to switch control of the webinar over to Gerry and Jamie. And thank you both for your work on this, and you have control now, right, Katie? Okay, thank you so much. If folks have questions, I'm sorry, one other item. If folks have questions, please hold them to the end, and there's a way to submit them online. And many of you are familiar with that process and have been a routine attendee here, so just hold those to the end, and we have about a dozen or so folks here in Silver Spring listening in as well. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, yeah. Aloha and good morning from Hawaii Standard Time. Today we're going to talk about bridging the gap between science, management, and communities in the Pacific Islands. My name is Jamison Gove, and I work for the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center, and I also lead the West Hawaii Integrated Ecosystem Assessment.
And I'm Gerry Davis. I'm the Assistant Regional Administrator for Habitat Conservation here in the Pacific Islands Regional Office, and I'm also the co-chair for the Habitat Focus Area in West Hawaii. So Jamie and I are going to tag team this for you today a little bit, but to help set the context, at least in talking about ecosystem-based management, we think that it's pretty important to help frame out at least the perspective we're going to present today. Ecosystem means a lot of different things to different people. You can certainly have ecosystem be very large spatial areas that would be like an archipelago or something like that, and it can be much smaller down at like the watershed level or a reef tract level. And so today our discussion is going to focus on that smaller unit where we're working in West Hawaii and we're working across a reef tract and a bunch of watersheds, and that'll be the framework that we're building on. And that has relevance at least for the part of the world that we live in, just because it's very common traditionally for the cultures here to actually use watershed context or an area-based context for their management. And that's really important if you're working with communities and getting that conversation started and that trust built, and them being familiar or kind of exposed to a practice that makes sense to them. So that was a very integral part of the effort that we've been involved with out here. So I'm going to break this into a couple pieces for you. For those that may not be familiar with what habitat focus areas are, it's a NOAA-wide program. Started in 2013, and we have two of them out here in the Pacific, and there was a process for establishing these areas. And of course, on the slide, it shows you that, you know, the objectives there. One was to demonstrate NOAA's wide capability in working together, because when you think about it, there's really not many cases where across NOAA they focus all their energy on a place. So this was a place to demonstrate publicly our capability in working together to make a difference in a place. One of the very primary targets for this particular effort was to have measurable natural resource improvements in 3 to 5 years. And so that's, you know, again, at least from my perspective, kind of light speed when it comes to actually seeing physical change in resources. So that's a very big deal. In terms of how we picked the sites, this was a pretty rigorous process, and it had, you know, criteria that were associated with it. That site selection is really critical, and I would say probably the most important part of that is realizing that habitat focus area efforts are really a coordination communication effort. And so you're bridging partnerships and trying to work with communities and other NGOs and governments in that process. So picking the site makes a huge difference. One of the key aspects of that was places that NOAA already had some work going on. And so the map that's in front of you shows you the West Hawaii area, and you can see a lot of overarching kind of circles in there showing all the different types of management that were already being considered in the place. That's kind of a key aspect of it. And there were also, as I mentioned, key criteria in terms of habitat focus areas. While I said it was a NOAA-wide effort, this was the second one to be created. West Hawaii was the second. The first was in California. And if you look at the criteria that here, the 1 through 5 existed for us to use when we started looking at defining where to work. Item 6 was something we added, and that's just because the place we live in is so culturally diverse, has so many different social attributes, and working within those two things actually really define often how well or poorly you can be effective. So it became a really important criteria. And I think that from our perspective, we're pretty proud of the fact that this became a regular criteria for the projects that followed. They saw it as a valuable thing in other places too.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a very brief overview of the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment in West Hawaii. And I'll start by saying Chris Harvey, who gave the EBFM presentation last month, gave a really incredible overview and introduction to the IEA and how it fits into ecosystem-based management. And so if you happen to catch that presentation, you obviously know all about IEAs. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. I think it's archived on the NOAA Central Library YouTube, and it's a really creative and entertaining way to to describe IEAs and EBFM and how they support each other. But briefly here, IEAs are really a collaborative, interdisciplinary, scalable, and adaptable process to synthesize scientific information, and that's really across the social ecological setting in relation to specific ecosystem management objectives. So this infographic that you see is sort of the various steps in that IEA process. And importantly, it starts with engaging and communicating with the local community members and resource managers so we can really define our targets and our goals and our objectives for ecosystem-based management. We then really go into thinking about developing indicators, assessing the ecosystem, evaluating risk and vulnerability, and eventually conducting management strategy evaluations, which provides the ability to elucidate trade-offs that we can then communicate to the community and resource managers for various management objectives. I said this is a process, but it is also a national program, and there are 5 specific regions: the California Current, Alaska, Northwest, Gulf of Mexico, and of course, West Hawaii. And I think, importantly, IEAs are really intended to provide the scientific information that underpins ecosystem-based management, with the purpose of really supporting healthy and resilient communities, economies, ecosystems, and of course, human well-being. And you're welcome to check out, we have a new website, and it's listed below, and you can explore further the IEA as well as what each of the regions are doing. And so now, specifically highlighting and talking about our region of focus, West Hawaii, obviously Hawaii is a pretty unique and interesting ecosystem within itself, but even with that, West Hawaii stands out as being special. It has the longest contiguous reef system in the entire main Hawaiian Islands, and historically and even today, it's been very productive and actually quite healthy. Obviously, Hawaii in general has about 25% endemism for marine species, and many of those are endangered. There's lots of fish ponds, inky lime pools, and lots of cultural resources and traditional practices still in place. Importantly, in West Hawaii, there's really a strong foundation of science conservation partnerships and community involvement. I think Gerry's mentioned already, and I think you'll find throughout this presentation the theme of community engagement and involvement, not just from us being involved with them, but vice versa. It's a two-way street with the community in Hawaii in terms of thinking about resource management and conservation. As with many ecosystems around the world, there are a number of threats that West Hawaii is facing, including watershed management and functional issues, some upland erosion, which has really been driving a lot of sedimentation into some very specific locations. We have some nutrient input issues, typically are primarily from wastewater, and I'll actually highlight that later in the presentation, as well as climate change and thinking about thermal stress and coral bleaching, and of course, some human-wildlife interactions, particularly related to cetaceans.
Yeah, so I think that, and Jamie's highlighted this a little bit, but I think it's also worth noting that a very big part, at least on the HFA connection with the science component of this, was our partnership with the Nature Conservancy, and that we have a cooperating agreement with them that helps get funds, and they have a huge community connection there. They've been doing work there already, and that's been a really integral part of the system in terms of the overall process, and that partnership with the nonprofits, with the state management agencies, natural resource management agencies, with the community and with the science and the management within NOAA has been really the kind of the earmark of the coordination that's made this project very useful. As Jamie was mentioning, that one of the big challenges, and you can see this from the photo, is that there's a lot of red in that photo, and that's red clay, and that's a real challenge anytime you have any kind of significant rain, and that's a whole combination of feral ungulate management and vegetative layer management type challenges in this site. One of the big things that we learned in doing this was that hotspot analysis of knowing where the sediment's coming from, putting money in targeting those places can be a much more efficient way of managing an area than trying to revegetate the whole thing, given the costs and other challenges. So,
yeah, some other projects we're collaborating on is to assess basically the relative resilience potential of reefs along the coastline, and that's actually an example we'll talk about in just a couple of slides.
Additionally, this slide represents a host of communities. So again, it's not just one community, it's a whole variety of communities. one of the things that's really proven important in the management context in this part of the world is let communities teach communities, or let communities share within communities. And that's a very effective way of learning and in practicing management, because you're learning from each other and you're building your own capacity. You don't have to look outside to find how to do something. And that's been a very important part of this integral system that's been built with science and management, and connecting those communities and allowing them to share. One of those examples is, the fish ponds. Another one would be the terrestrial feral ungulate management, and managing usership in those places are all examples of things that have worked that way.
We've also worked together, primarily led by the HFA, but in collaboration with the Science Center, to identify some essential fish habitat at slightly deeper places that we didn't previously have surveys. And so part of that was using some multi-beam survey technology as well as some drop cameras. And those maps have been served to the state, the regional office, and actually publicly available for download. The ecosystem status reports are actually mentioned as part of the IEA loop. The IEA has led that effort in collaboration with like I said, the HFA and other institutions. And we came out with our first one in 2016, and it's really a compilation of indicators to help track the state of the ecosystem from a social ecological perspective. And we're about ready to release our next one, hopefully next month, certainly before the end of the year. And I'll present a couple of indicators later in this presentation from that report. We've also tried to put some energy into doing some management strategy evaluation. So recently we teamed up with the state, the Habitat Focus Area, TNC, and others, and produced a report and actually a paper in Journal of Applied Ecology. Mariska Wiedemann led that effort, but I think it was a really cool way to highlight how we can work with the state and evaluate various fisheries management strategies, and again, importantly, to describe and quantify what the trade-offs are associated with that to help them with their future fisheries management decision making. So again, just want to close this one out by highlighting that the real test of something like this is really how your stakeholders engage. And I think with that partnership with TNC and with the strategic planning component and the science involvement, that it's made for a pretty neat team in terms of how stakeholders look at potential for management success in these areas. And that's really been, at least to me, the success of this project, is when your stakeholders feel like they're getting the outcomes they want with the support that they want, it becomes a pretty viable process. So again, the highlight here is that connection for HFA and IEA in that ecosystem fishery management context. And again, to me, the outcome of this was really developing a coordination component, a communication system that worked across communities, across NGOs, across governments, across the state and federal governments in a partnership. And again, this is kind of the wave of the future for us. We're never going to have all the capacity we need to do it individually. But by taking advantage of all forms of knowledge, whether they're Western science or traditional knowledge, then you have a pretty successful package or plan for how to move such a experience forward. Yeah, and so, Gerry and I have provided a couple of examples and sort of a list of some of the projects, but we felt like, to really illustrate the ways at which we're working together and engaging and working with community and the state, we felt like it might be worth digging into an example. And so what we're going to talk about for that example is some reef resilience assessments and some work that we undertook starting in 2015. And the goals of that project were to identify areas that are really most likely to resist or recover from the impacts of climate change. And again, so we could prioritize those areas for management action. But we also want to identify stressors that might be compromising that resilience or degrading the resilience of individual reefs, so that we could provide some suggestions or management opportunities to address some of those stressors. So again, looking here, it just highlights, where those assessment locations were surveyed. And this again represents a community engagement, stakeholder engagement process where, in working with the state and with the communities that were there, we highlighted places that we felt were really critical to have timeline and measurement of health and condition. And that again highlights the fact that we're using both traditional awareness, site fidelity, and people who are familiar with the places,
that state ownership or resource trusteeship, along with the science and management capability within the agency. So while there's a lot of sites here, there's a lot more hidden behind it in the effort that was taken in defining that those would be good sites for us to monitor.
Yeah, so in the Hawaii, the habitat focus area in collaboration with TNC and the state really led the charge on that site selection and doing the in-water surveys. Well, coincidentally, those in-water surveys were timed with really the most widespread and devastating coral bleaching event West Hawaii has really ever seen. And just as a look at the time series of temperature for the last 120 years, this is for the whole main Hawaiian Island, so from the Big Island to Kauai. You can see 2015 really stands out as an anomalously warm year. And in fact, West Hawaii was disproportionately hit with that. Some reef logger temperatures we had hit over 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 87 degrees Fahrenheit. And so for perspective, typical temperatures are more like 27 or 28 degrees Celsius, or 80 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was really a very warm year and an unprecedented event for the region. So to say it was well timed is really not the probably best way to describe it, but given the purpose of the surveys were to try and identify sites or relative resilience within the context of climate change, we were able to collect really good information on that. And so just to kind of talk about the bleaching and severity and geographic spread, basically between 60 to 70% of all sites experience bleaching, or excuse me, all sites experience between 60 to 70% bleaching. And I'll point out on this map, the smaller circles are shallower sites. They're between 5 to 7 meters, and the deeper sites are 12 to 15 meters. So you can see up to, some of the sites were as high as 80%. And I think just to highlight before we get to the next slide is that there's also clear spatial variation in the severity of bleaching. So the northern sites, got hit quite a bit harder than, say, some of the other sites towards the south. And just to jump straight to the chase and the results here is that, again, we assessed through all those indicators that Gerry presented a couple of slides ago, we can identify the relative resilience among those sites. And you can see that in green is a higher resilience and red is lower resilience. And so you can see that the resilience ranking kind of sort of matched the bleaching, not entirely, but certainly bleaching resistance really drove spatial variation and relative resilience, as did a couple of other indicators, including coral recruitment and macroalgae. And again, the purpose of this was to really try and identify sites that we think are most likely to resist and recover from the impacts of climate change, and try and identify the key characteristics in those sites that promote that resilience. Well, that's really only part of the story in terms of what you think about what drives resilience. So at the same time that the Habitat Focus Area and the Nature Conservancy and all the rest of us were working on these resilience, there was another project going on called the Ocean Tipping Points, and specifically working with Joey Lucky, who works with us in the IEA. We're developing spatial maps of human or anthropogenic pressure data across the whole state. And I've listed the publication if you want to look that up. Lisa Wedding led that, and there's a project page on PacGaius that you can download some of these data. But what you're looking at now is sort of an enhancement of that, and what's incorporated in these surveys is we wanted to basically say, okay, well, we know what the relative resilience are, but what are some of the local stressors that might be eroding or degrading or impacting that resilience? And so here's just some examples of the data sets we put together. And I'll just highlight, we did some land-based runoff, some looking at impervious surfaces. And so obviously water is not really going to penetrate on an impervious surface, and it gets exported to the nearshore environment and taking whatever else it does. Wastewater pollution, I mentioned earlier about nutrient input. So you may or may not know, most places in rural Hawaii, in particular West Hawaii, are on-site sewage disposal systems. So an OSDS is really a septic tank or a cesspool. And a cesspool is really just a hole in the ground where effluent receives no treatment before entering the environment. And about 80% of all on-site disposal systems are cesspools in West Hawaii. So, for example, in 2017, like 680 million gallons of effluent reached the nearshore environment through submarine groundwater And so that's really an important thing to understand in terms of thinking about relative resilience potential, as well as finally fishing pressure. So we're looking at non-commercial, and in Hawaii, non-commercial, which is basically subsistence, recreational, and cultural reasons for fishing, is a major component of nearshore fishing. For example, over this time frame, the annual average from 2004 to 2013 for this entire coastline was about 24 times that of the commercial catch. So the non-commercial catch is clearly disproportionate in terms of the fishing pressure. So all of these things are things that the IEA were leading and trying to develop kind of at the same time, that fed really nicely into how we move forward with this resilience information.
So I guess when you see things like that, a lot of times, unfortunately, public thinks, oh my gosh, there's nothing we can do. But that's the real, I think, strength of a project like this, is it's giving us tools for looking at how to manage better forward. And so when you look at a system that's been heavily impacted by bleaching, we now have a better idea of where places do better, what their survivorship, what their ability to endure that is. We also have a better understanding of what the recovery potential of a place like that is. We also know that there's other stressors there that we can manage that will also improve that resilience by looking at better water quality, reducing sedimentation. And so what this is doing is giving managers tools for saying, okay, I know this area is more important because it's more likely to be a source in the future, so I can work harder to protect it. Or these are the types of things I can do to put that site in a higher level of resilience that'll have a better ability to endure the risks and challenges that it has. So it's that great linkage between management and science, and that connectivity from a community communication and even state management perspective, where we can be that great servant in providing really valuable management information in that process.
Yeah, and so how that actually bears out when we combine the resilience scores and the various data layers and information on local human impacts, we can essentially create a list of series of suggestions for resource managers and community members to think about or to consider when they're targeting to support reef conservation or support resilience. And so a couple of examples I've highlighted in green. This is a site that we have identified, or through this is identified, that might be an area to suggest for conservation. And what that means is this is a site that has relatively high resilience, but doesn't necessarily have any major stressors, but more importantly, doesn't necessarily have any place-based management currently in place. So there's statewide rules, but not necessarily geographic-specific management. So it's an opportunity there that the state or the community could potentially take up. And as well as in blue, we highlighted an area that has above average relative resilience, but the water quality, whether it's because of on-site disposal systems or any of the other layers that we have under water quality, is potentially an issue. So it's possible that the water quality in that location may erode the relative resilience. So it's a place that, you know, we either monitor and or mitigate water quality issues. And so that was, again, a combination largely led by the Habitat Focus Area in collaboration with many others that we've mentioned. And what we wanted to do from the IEA is basically there was a lot of momentum there, and we wanted to take that momentum and move it forward. And building upon the resilience surveys, what we wanted to do is look at, well, how do each of these sites, what is their vulnerability to climate change? And so just to provide a very brief introduction and to help delineate between what's the difference between resilience and vulnerability, this figure is basically borrowed from the International Panel on Climate Change, where we can see clearly resilience on the right-hand side, and that can be sensitive or it can be impacted by human stressors or activities. And then we also include climate change. So what does the future hold for coral reefs in West Hawaii within the context of warming ocean temperatures? So if we combine those things, we then get a relative assessment of vulnerability to climate change in West Hawaii. And about all of this same time that the rest of this work is happening, we partnered with Jeff Maynard and Ruben van Hooydonk to look at local scale projections of coral reef futures within the context of future thermal stress. And so climate change our climate model output is traditionally at 1 degree, which is 110 by 110 kilometers, which is about 2 pixels for the whole coast of the Big Island, which isn't super helpful when it comes to thinking about science and management decision making. So we embarked on really led by these two, embarked on an endeavor to downscale that 1 degree down to 4 kilometers for basically all core reefs around the world. And so you can look up that information. There's a publication, Scientific Reports, I've listed, but also Core Reef Watch has a Google Earth file that you can zoom around and look at all the core reefs around the world. But the point being is the map that you're looking at is the spatial variation in the onset of annual severe bleaching. So what that means is the year at which we're likely to see widespread and severe bleaching every year thereafter. So for West Hawaii, we're likely to see annual severe bleaching starting between 2035 and 2045, which is unfortunately a lot sooner than I'd like for it to be. But basically taking that information, we can then combine, we can go to the next slide. Yeah. What we ended up doing was partnering with additional institutions and agencies like the National Park Service. Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center had some additional surveys, and so we expanded the geographic scope to the entire West Coast. We have about 70 sites, and we took exposure, again, this is the annual onset of severe bleaching, added resilience and human impacts, and we end up getting vulnerability. And you can see that there's clear spatial variation in the vulnerability of reefs in West Hawaii to climate change. And I think that just the end highlight is that this information is really intended to support resource management decision, either by the state or local communities for what they are interested in doing at a site-specific scale. And again, this is a broad collaborative effort between the IEA, the Habitat Focus Area, and so on. And you can find the resilience assessments are available on Chorus and actually some other locations. And then the vulnerability assessment should be coming soon and should be on the IEA website within the next couple of months.
So again, this is, I think, really worth highlighting and emphasizing, if it hasn't already come through clearly, is that much of this success is really built around community. And I think that in the selection process, one of the very big considerations is how ready is the community to take on this kind of effort, and what kind of engagement will you get, and what role will they play. And quite honestly, in my opinion, it's the communities that have really demonstrated the true value of such an effort by, one, making clear what they think is important and their knowledge of that place, and how to engage the scientists and the managers and the state and federal government in that process. And so the picture that you have here is just one of the communities at that site that have formed their own planning process for an area that they're trying to restore and manage. And they've developed a very strong partnership with the Nature Conservancy and with the state and federal government in, one, mapping that process, one, implementing it, and then being a ready and able partner in moving the good implementation part of the process forward. Because as I mentioned, a very big target was to have measurable outcomes in 3 to 5 years as a success scenario from a criteria standpoint. In the end, I think that this effort, one of the other things that it did that really helped the communities is it became a platform to organize and provide a means by which to inform all the different audiences involved in this. So it became a big logistical thing. And as much as the science and the focus was important, I think that the communication became the real outcome that made the difference for the community and for the resources, just because that didn't exist before, and it was something that was lacking in connecting all of the different players and having a status and a condition capability on resources. So another very important part of this is the state is involved in an effort called 30 by 30, which is managing 30% of coastal resources effectively by 2030. And so this project provided a huge amount of science, assessment, management option, partnerships that the state can use. And again, effective management is one of those difficult words to define, so that we all have different understanding of what we think that would mean. But nonetheless, this provided a really tremendous asset to the state in moving forward. And I think that, at least from Jamie and my perspective, that connection with the state and being pulled into that 30 by 30 process as technical and resource experts to help support their 30 by 30 effort is another great example of how a tool like this can be extremely meaningful given the challenges we have with climate and fisheries and land-based sources of pollution, and moving forward and making sure that future generations can still enjoy the resources that we so cherish in this part of the world. Anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, I think that we, looking towards the future, I think we're trying to shape a new way to approach our partnerships and collaborations. Trying to break down the barriers between science and management, community and stakeholders, and realize at the end of the day we all in this together. We obviously have various expertise and training, but I think we're trying to move towards a common goal here. And I think what we presented today is by no means perfect, nor do we have this nailed down. We're trying to figure it out ourselves, but I think that hopefully we're able to communicate that really there is this important interplay and partnership and transparency and communication that helps really build some of the success stories we presented, and certainly will be foundational for us moving forward.
And I think with that, we're kind of through what we wanted to do, but I also wanted to just thank the organizers for the opportunity to share, and we certainly would welcome if there's any questions or additional insights.
Thank you, Gerry and Jamie. Excellent job. What we'll do now is see if we have any questions coming in. I think we might. And yep, we do. And then also turn to folks here in Silver Spring in the library. So anyone in the library first? Any questions for these folks? Okay. Katie, we're going to turn to you and see if you could tell us if there are questions there.
Guys, we have one question from Kaylin, asking if since you're doing collaborations across sectors, what metrics are you using to measure the involvement of the community and that success?
Yeah, so again, it depends on which platform you use, but so on the HFA side of things, there's actually an implementation strategy that breaks it into different categories. Community is one of them. And depending on the community, some of them have different targets. So you have both the participation, but also the products that they have identified as important to them in terms of that process. So again, there's in the Hawaiian culture, they usually call them huis, and they're kind of groups of people that work together. And so there's a number of community huis that have been orchestrated through this process that both share information and identify priorities in trying to move things forward. So it's not really a count statistic, it's more engagement from a process standpoint that's used as the tool for determining community engagement.
Yeah, and I think for us, we have had various workshops and science symposia open to the public through the years. And in terms of metrics, I don't know that we have quantifiable metrics, but certainly in terms of participation, over the years, we've gone from 50 to 80 people at that symposia to nearly 300. And I think, just in terms of the community members reaching out and working with us has exponentially grown. So I think that's important. So it is difficult to have metrics for engagement with the community. I think ultimately our metric of success is, basically having the information that we're putting out and in terms of working with the regional office, the science center, and the state is going to underpin and underlie and help support some of the decision making, right? And that's where Gerry and I's involvement in 30 by 30, it seems very optimistic that's where a lot of our efforts will potentially be realized.
Thank you very much. Any other questions here? Okay, looking around the room. Looks like another one came in online from Isaac. Can you see that? Okay, it's a long one.
So, are there efforts to replicate the West Hawai'i IEA to other areas within the Pacific Pacific Islands region?
That's an interesting question. No, the answer is no. I think for right now, we put a lot of effort and energy into building relationships, which is really key in Hawaii and really anywhere to be able to make inroads and to build trust and be sitting at the table with when we're talking about resource management decisions and the science that's important. That's taken a lot of time and a lot of listening and a lot of humility to get there. I think thinking about the fact that the IEA is a process, it's not necessarily a program. We certainly can transplant or transport or whatever you want to say, but take that process and move it to different geographies and regions and invest that time and listen to communities and listen to the managers there and see what their needs are. So, I would imagine that at some point, absolutely, it will, this process will be taken on the road, so to speak, but I don't think we'll ever abandon the West Hawaii community, for example.
I think it's a good thing. It's a great question. I think it's one of those really big challenges is that you never leave communities once you establish relationship. It's too small a system to build something up like this and then just run away. That being said, there's never enough resources to do it in all places. So it's finding that good balance and moving forward of, yes, you want to be able to share what you learn from this process so it can be used in other places. You're never going to be able to manage all watersheds through a process like this, but you want to be able to service them the best you can. So we're still trying to sort a lot of those things out from an agency standpoint in terms of, okay, we've gotten this far, we've developed good community relationships, we've had some successes. Yes, we want to replicate that in other places, but we don't want to abandon the relationships that we've already built. So it's still kind of a work in progress in some regards too, for like the HFA stuff, where we always intended to replicate that process, but we don't want to leave the communities that we've already helped in a place where they can't move forward positively too.
Great, thanks, Gerry. Jamie? I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
Did we have a hand up on there? No? Okay. I think that concludes all the questions we have here and online. Again, thanks to you both for an excellent presentation. And just as a reminder, again, this is a monthly series. The next presentation is on December 12th, and we're going to transport our audience to the Antarctic. We have Jefferson Hinke who will give a talk on ecosystem-based fisheries management in the Southern Ocean with a focus on Antarctic krill. So join us on the 12th of December for that. And again, thanks for everyone who patiently attended today, and look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.